Everybody, Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast, or welcome back if that's the case. We're going to be doing a little bit of boxing history today, which means, as you can see, I'm here with my boy Aris Pina, who's a CompuBox operator and just like myself, a lover of both boxing and fight history. What's up, bro?
What's going on, man? This is going to be a quick show, but a fun show that we're going to talk about because it's the anniversary of one of my favorite fights. And I hit you up earlier today to bring it up, and you were like, "Yeah, man, let's do it." So today we're going to talk about the 25th anniversary of Pernell Whitaker, Diosbelys Hurtado.
You know, and
It kind of, and you want to think about it, a fight that's kind of it's remembered by people from fans from that era that obviously were, and it wasn't that. I mean, 25 years ago was a long time ago, but like it still seems, I don't know, like, because considering it's still the 90s, like, I don't know, it doesn't seem like it was that long ago, even though it was. Does that make sense?
well, I feel like like we were saying before we started taping, dude. I feel like I remember so much about this time
Mm-hmm.
like it was yesterday, bro. But
It was an
then
exciting time to be a boxing fan, bro. It
for
really was,
sure,
especially for us who were obviously younger back then. I was 12 years old at this point, but I was still like in the beginning phases of being a fan, like a hardcore fan. I became a hardcore fan around 1990, like in mid 95. And then that's when I started reading every magazine I could find, buying all different books that my parents were buying for me, old magazines, and watching everything I could watch. So I knew who everybody was at that point. By the beginning of 1997, I had a good grasp on the sport, at least I felt I did. And, who was who and all that. And so it was just when it was a good era, man. The welterweight division was going through a golden era. Boxing in general had a lot of great talent, a lot of big fights. The 96 Olympics had just concluded the year before, which was going to bring in a whole new birth of talent for the next few years, including Floyd Mayweather. Like, it was a lot going on, and it was a good time.
yeah, dude, you had right around this time, or right before this fight that happened in early '97, Antonio Tarver, Fernando Vargas, Floyd Mayweather, the
Yeah.
David Reed, those fighters from that '96 team were about to either turn pro or had turned pro. I mean, yeah, man, and now we're just now kind of finishing off a number of those fighters' careers. Some of them finished off several years ago,
Yeah.
but Floyd Mayweather's still kind of kicking around and doing his thing, whatever that thing may
He's
be.
gonna beat up some billionaire's kid, isn't he?
Yeah, something. I don't. It's literally 100% someone I had never heard of before I heard he
Neither
was
have I.
fighting them.
Never heard of that in my life. But you know what?
So that just goes to show you, bro. 25 years has passed since. 25 years have passed since this fight that we're about to be talking about, and we're starting to, I guess, get up there in years too because we haven't heard of motherfuckers that so and so's fighting so and so. Who? Just because it's
I
in
mean, we're at that
YouTube or
age where we
whatever.
shouldn't know who these people are, right?
No, yeah, we're starting to that's starting to stretch beyond us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I can't keep up with these TikTokers. But anyways,
Yeah, enough about how old we're getting.
yeah,
Regardless,
exactly.
I think
Regardless of us becoming old timers, the mid to late 90s was a golden era for the welterweight division. All right, that's what we were getting to. And it
totally.
hadn't quite hit that golden era yet, like, because at this point now, you had Pernell Whitaker, who was champion since around 1992 when he beat Buddy McGirt. I mean, Whitaker was the gold standard of boxing. He was probably still considered, if not Roy Jones, who might have surpassed him at this point. Probably did. Excuse me, actually. But they were right there battling out for the top two positions of pound for pound best fighter in the world. Felix Trinidad was, the WBA, excuse me, was IBF welterweight champion and making noise on Showtime, and people were clamoring for a fight between Whitaker and Trinidad. And it looked like it was going to happen a couple of times. Remember that doubleheader that they had on HBO when Whitaker beat up Jake Rodriguez and Trinidad beat up Larry Barnes? But eventually that ended up falling apart because it's boxing. Of course it did. And then there was Ike Corte as well. Ike Corte, who hadn't at that point, I think, I don't remember when he made his HBO debut, whether it was 96 or 97 against Vince Phillips, but it was around that time. I'm going to say 97. But
sounds right.
or like well, it was around, it might have been 96 or 97. It could have been, actually, I think he made his HBO debut on the undercard of a Whitaker Rivera fight, one of those. But Regardless, Corte was in the mix as well. And add in Jose Luis Lopez, who was about to come on the scene as well. You had a pretty good mix, but the main key player was Oscar De La Hoya. Oscar De La Hoya, former lightweight champion, biggest star in boxing if he wasn't, the top pound for pound fighter yet, was getting ready to move up to the welterweight division. And since Whitaker and Trinidad fell apart, this was the next big fight that they wanted to make. It was going to be the Golden Boy against Pernell Whitaker, and the fight was more or less all set. So they, as big fights usually goes, there's always like a tune-up intern fight right before the big one and stuff like that. At least it was much more like that back in the day. So Oscar De La Hoya went through his tune-up. Was a pretty heavy tune-up to think back when he fought former lightweight champion and then undefeated champ Miguel Angel Gonzalez, which was a junior welterweight title fight. Oscar hadn't moved up yet. And, a couple of bruises here and there, but Oscar pretty much dominated from beginning to end and held up his end of the bargain. Whitaker, on the other hand, who out of the slowly now in the past year, 1996, started to show signs of slippage for the first time in his two fights with with Wilfredo Rivera. People thought he was on the downslide. The first fight with Rivera, it was a lot closer than anyone had ever seen Whitaker really in a fight, and because of that, people started thinking that Whitaker must be done, like he must be cooked. A guy like Rivera in the early 90s wouldn't have been able to touch Whitaker, but by 96, 97, he gave him two pretty close fights. And the consensus thinking was, well, if Whitaker is going to be touched up by a guy like Rivera, what's Oscar going to do to him? But regardless, even with that being said, they thought his next fight, which was against a complete unknown at the time, against a guy named Diosbelys Hurtado, they kind of figured at that moment, well, even if Whitaker might be slipping a little bit, he has clearly enough to whip this guy easily and then move on to the super fight. But the reason why we're talking about it today is because that was definitely not the case. Sorry for the long-windedness.
No, dude, you set that up nicely, I think. I think a lot of people remember this fight for the ending. I mean, and obviously because the ending's pretty shocking. But yeah, no, I think it's a good setup because it kind of provides some historical context to exactly why this fight was what it was and why it was kind of like the spotlight was on this fight. Oscar De La Hoya's ringside, knowing that a big fight with Pernell Whitaker, who had been struggling for a number of years to really get the credit. It was almost kind of like I know that they're not the exact same kind of fighter. I know it's not the exact same kind of situation, but similar to how for a number of years Chocolatito Gonzalez was like, we knew about him. We gave him credit. There was no problem. But it took a long time for him to break through and get on to HBO to finally kind of get recognized by slightly more mainstream, or at least more casual kind of boxing fans and stuff like
By
that.
that time, I'm not even sure if he was clearly, at his peak yet. I mean, if he might have been slightly past his peak at that point.
Exactly. And that was the unfortunate thing, is that, we really didn't, we got to see a number of his fights on like pay-per-view undercards and stuff like that occasionally, but not that often, not nearly often
him,
enough.
Mark Swanson was another perfect example that we
exactly. That's a good one too, who like kind of later in his career started getting slightly better paydays and more opportunities. But Pernell Whitaker also was denied that kind of mainstream respect and the paydays and stuff like that, even though he had gone on to pound for pound list and was clearly a really good fighter and recognized as possibly the best fighter on the planet, even despite a number of the drug issues and legal issues that he had consistently had in the 90s, right? Like leading into the later 90s and stuff like that. So, this was a big opportunity because, on the other hand, Oscar De La Hoya was the golden boy. He was the Olympic gold medalist. And he was, for a number of years, whether it was in the boxing establishment, but also locally, he was considered like soft. He was considered a guy that, he hadn't been tested. He had been coddled. He had been propped up, etc.
Fighting a lot smaller. There was always the thing that he was a big lightweight fighting smaller.
Exactly.
And other guys.
Or older fighters or whatever.
Yeah.
And this was kind of looked at in that same light, except for at the very least, Pernell Whitaker wasn't that far removed from clearly being the best fighter on the planet, or one of the best fighters on the planet, one of the
Hmm.
best 2 or 3 fighters on the planet. So, I mean, I think that Oscar De La Hoya looked at this opportunity as something like to legitimize himself in the eyes of a number of fans and pundits and stuff like that. Like if he could beat Pernell Whitaker, then yeah. So he's sitting ringside. It's a big opportunity for Pernell Whitaker to shine too. And I think that something that it would have been obviously a lot more difficult in 1997 to do this research. Like in 1997, there wouldn't have been box rec, like there wouldn't have been the easy references and stuff like that we can make now. And it would have been all like what is it, fight rec or fights rec, whatever the old one was, or fight facts. Sorry, fight facts. Yeah,
Like,
that's right. Fight facts. They literally did that shit on a fax machine. And so, like, if it wasn't on there, you might not know about it. Or if you weren't able to contact some historian who happened to know, or a writer who interviewed and knew about it, then you're going to have a difficult time finding a backstory. What they wouldn't have known, or at least what they wouldn't have known that much, beyond just the name, was that Diosbelys Hurtado was trained and brought up, at least, as an amateur by Alcides Segarra, who is, or I think is, I don't believe is dead. I'm pretty sure he's still alive, and I'm pretty sure he still works with the IABA in some capacity. But he trained just a slew of great Cuban fighters, both amateur and fighters who later turned pro. I mean, literally just going down the list here, I'll be brief. It's Rolando Garbe is one of the first ever Cuban national champions that they had, period. And he trained Rolando Garbe. Let's see. Oh, obviously, Yoel Casamayor, Diosbelys Hurtado, Guillermo Rigondo, Jorge Luis Gonzalez, Juan Carlos Gomez, the Castillo brothers, Eliseo and Elisir. Um, yeah, Felix Savon,
I
Teofilo
mean, this was like a
Stevenson,
who's who of Cuban
literally
amateurs
who's
and
who.
pros of the '90s. Yeah.
Odlenir Solis, a literal who's who of Cuban fighters in the amateur system and fighters who wound up fleeing too. In 1994, Hurtado defects from Cuba.
Yep.
And so we're only 3 years into his pro career, and he's racked up 20 wins in 3 years. I mean, it's difficult to say if you don't know the fighter or haven't seen them or whatever. You don't really know what those 20 wins mean. But
And it's
obviously, he was very polished and very well schooled. And
yeah, because
perhaps they didn't know that going
he
in.
was a very like I don't have his amateur credentials in front of me, but he was definitely a very accomplished amateur. And then as you said, he defected. And with his first 20 wins, I mean, a lot of them are kind of like spotty wins and other guys just kind of like building experience, but he did have a couple of names on there. For instance, Antonio Rivera, the last fight he had before he fought Pernell Whitaker, was a former champion. Well, even though it was a featherweight champion, it was still, a champion nonetheless from back in the day. Excuse me, Anthony Ivory is another guy who was a very experienced journeyman. Desi Ford was another guy who had a name back in the day. So he had a couple of names. They weren't like big names or anything. Definitely not someone that would give you credentials to challenge a Pernell Whitaker for a championship, or even get you ranked back then for that matter. But
He
for
wasn't
whatever
just some
reason,
dude off the street.
no, he definitely wasn't. And I remember as the thing about me as a kid when I used to get excited about fights was that besides like the big names that everybody knew about, I watched them on television. If I read about a person in the magazine, whether it was Ring, KO, World Boxing, Boxing, insert whatever year it was, all that type of stuff, whenever they featured a profile on like a new face or up and coming prospect, whatever it may be, I always remembered that guy. And like you said, and there's no internet really or all this other stuff going on, if I would, so I didn't know who was going to be fighting on TV half the time, but if I randomly would see them and see that prospect I just read about was on TV, I'd get kind of excited because I'm like, hey, wait a minute, I just read about this guy. He must be good. This is going to be cool. And Hurtado was one of those guys featured. He was featured along with, I believe he was a middleweight, his stablemate named Mario Araban or something that nature. Anyways, but I did read about Hurtado. He was featured in the Boxing Illustrated magazine as a new face and like a future up and comer. And at that point, he was only like 13-0 or something like that. But I remember his face because I remember the photo because it just looked kind of awkward. He was standing straight up, not really in a pose. I think he was wearing pink hand wraps and his Cuban trunks, and he just more or less looked kind of unimposing. But for what I remember that photo and I kept the visual memory of it. So in the mid 90s, I'm sure you remember this too, when you're watching an HBO broadcast, during between rounds, sometimes you would hear the sound like the intro for a song, and then they would show you upcoming HBO fights, for the different dates. Blah, 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 this guy's gonna blah, blah, blah. And then one of them was Pernell Whitaker versus Hurtado. And I went, wait a minute, I just read about that Hurtado guy. He's fighting Whitaker? Holy crap. Like, me, 12-year-old me, I got kind of excited because, again, I just read about this guy, never seen him fight, but he's going to fight Whitaker. This must be good. And then we found out, again, bro, because, like, you can't take, and so leading up to this fight now, Whitaker's a 10-1 favorite. This is more or less a tune-up for him. We tried to find, if anything, if he was ranked. You found out he doesn't even look like he was ranked back then. So this was kind of just a tune-up to get Whitaker one more fight. In anticipation for Oscar. Like you said, Oscar was ringside, everything was all set up, but that's when, the unexpected went down.
Like another quick footnote about Diosbelys Hurtado, and I didn't really even know this time. I had to go look. And it's on BoxRec. It's on his little profile, like among his amateur accomplishments or whatever. And so he was one of the Cuban national champions, and you don't become a Cuban national champion like by nothing. You generally have to beat a number of really good fighters to become a Cuban national champion. Can't remember what weight it was at. It was either lightweight or junior welterweight, something like that. But one of the fighters he beat, Mario Quindelon, back in, I'm pretty sure
very, very, very accomplished amateur in himself.
Very accomplished amateur. And back in, I'm pretty sure it was the 2004 Olympics. And that's another thing about a number of Cuban fighters that they participated in like several Olympic games. Not just one or something like that, and then turned pro, obviously. But I believe it was the 2004 Olympics. Amir Khan was heavily favored. There was a lot of hype behind him being like the next Nassim Hamed or something like that. That was a reference often made, probably dumb because he's Middle Eastern. But I guess there was some similarity between the style potentially. He also had really fast hands, he could hit, etc. Long
and
story short,
he was only around, what you said, like 17 at that point.
Yeah, he was like 18 or something like that. He was,
young.
Yeah, he was.
But he was the wonder
young.
kid. Yeah, there was a lot of hype around him. He was featured. Unlike, if you weren't besides the American team, which is obviously the ones that always get featured for television, there was a lot of hype around him and talking. Yeah.
I remember, like specifically wanting to watch him and, check him out after hearing some of the hype. And Mario Quindelon wound up defeating Amir Khan in the Olympics. And then they had this big to-do where they had a rematch.
I'm sorry, I find that to be the most funniest, ridiculous thing that he had to avenge that. Like, of course, Quindelon's going to lose that fight. That's like Bad Lusiki going to fighting Mike McTeague on St. Patrick's Day. Like, they weren't going to let Khan lose that one. I've never seen the fight. But I mean, yeah.
it was bad. But regardless, and this was Mario Quindelon toward the end, of his amateur career, because he had been an amateur for a long time. But nonetheless, point is, one of the fighters was far more prime. One of the fighters that Hurtado had to defeat was a far more prime Mario Quindelon to become a Cuban national champion. And again, this isn't the kind of thing that they probably would have known, going like anybody in main events or on Pernell Whitaker's team or even HBO. Like they would have had some pretty hardcore HBO analysts doing this shit in 1997 to find this out. So
who matchmakers back then? It would be Carl Moretti, because he was with main events back then. So it would have been Moretti. And
was Lou still with there? Was Lou still there in 97 and early 97? He would have been, right?
Lou was with HBO, so he was the executive, the guy that made the decisions on putting on the fights. So I'm sure they knew.
Well, I'm not saying Lou's responsible. I'm just saying,
he
would have had to sign off on it.
Yeah, I'm sure he signed off on it just because, that's what they said the fight was going to be like. He had signed off for worse during that era. Well, look at the Roy Jones fights he was doing. So, I would say though, it's just so odd to think that, because like, as we're about to get into, it's literally the last style you would want to put Whitaker in against, especially if you want to use it as a tune-up for a major fight.
And dude, I have to say, I don't remember, like I was saying to you, I hadn't seen this fight in a little bit. I had to go rewatch it. And I don't remember, I guess maybe I just don't remember the commentating from it. But one of the versions you'll go, if you go look for the fight, you'll see the ESPN Classic version of it, which I don't think has the HBO commentating on it. I think it has the, the redub,
John Scully and
something like that. And but the actual HBO broadcast is also out there. And I watched that one, and dude, there was a couple epic comments and some pretty good moments from the commentating of this fight where they actually called some shit really spot on in terms of like the technique and the styles. And then there were also a couple of just like comments like from Foreman and Larry that I was like, what? Holy shit. That also just kind of, brought me right back to that time in like the late 90s and early 2000s that were like, there were some epic, super epic moments and like fight calls on HBO, whether you liked these guys or not, because there were moments where I really fucking hated some of these guys or hated some of the things they said or how they acted or whatever. But there were some straight fucking epic commentating tracks, bro.
I mean, it the fight in itself was just like, what the hell? It started in the very, very opening moments of the first round. If you watch it, you know what I mean? They came out there and Whitaker came out very nonchalant, like he usually did. I mean, especially for this one, you can tell that. And he walked in, Hurtado, who no one had seen yet, like you mentioned, unless maybe he was featured on a local mic station or something. Yep, pop, just catches Whitaker with a quick shot, and Whitaker goes bouncing right, and gets knocked right on his ass really quick. And everybody's kind of shocked by it, but Whitaker just laughs about it. Like he's almost, yeah, and he gets up and he laughs. He literally laughs. I remember that was the first thing. He's just kind of like, because it was almost funny. Like, it was seconds after the bell rang, he rang and all, but he had no idea.
I was just gonna say it was like the first moment of the fight, and it happened over and over again. Where looking back, it's almost like Pernell going, "I know that trick." Like, fuck, this guy's out meing me. What the fuck? Like, and that was the first kind of moment, just like 3 seconds into the fight, like boop,
And it
just
was a
got him.
tough style, man. It was one like Hurtado was one of those guys that he's a runner, but you wouldn't want to consider him like a guy that just stood on his bicycle the whole time. He would stand and fight you. It looked like he was slapping a little bit, but he had pop in his punches because it was so sudden, so quick that like he could catch you. And that's what he was doing to Whitaker. And Whitaker, especially by the beginning of 1997, Whitaker was not as quick on his feet as he used to be. Was he still elusive? Absolutely, as he showed in the De La Hoya fight. But he still, do what he had to do to win? Absolutely. But he was never Mr. Aggressive to begin with. He was never a guy that just went in there and like he always had someone else lead and then he kind of went off of that. And to be, first of all, an aggressor against a guy like Hurtado, who was clearly faster of foot than Whitaker was at that point, and probably had quicker hands too than Whitaker, slightly quicker, and just in his overall, young and just really, I hate to say Cuban style, but like he had that certain style that was just going to give anybody fits. And that's exactly what he was doing to Whitaker at that point. Like Whitaker was not expecting anything like this, and all of a sudden, the fight that he didn't want to do was make a track meet or try to have to chase this guy down and really try to do things with him is what he was being forced to do. Hurtado was moving around, stop really quick, bah, 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 and then he would take off again. Bah, 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 bah. Like this is literally the worst style for any type of Whitaker, and this is what he has to deal with now. Right before possibly the biggest fight of his career, aside from the Chavez fight, and now you have Oscar De La Hoya ringside after like the first 3-4 rounds, who's starting to fidget a little bit, going, like, what am I watching here? And high drama started to take place.
Yeah, they start interviewing Oscar, and he's like, "Yeah, he's over there. He's not doing real well." It's like, Oscar's sounding pretty nervous, dude. It's like, oh shit. And
he's seeing all the dollar signs float away, and he's like, "Oh no, now I'm gonna have to fight Ike on these dudes."
Dude, it's pretty funny to sit there and watch. But one of the things that's funny to also watch back is that Hurtado fought, I don't want to say like dirty, but he fought relatively dirty.
I mean,
like
he got points taken off in the fight because
he got 2 knockdowns, and both knockdowns got evened out because he got points taken off. Although Whitaker also lost a point later on, but it was like, dude, another part of this equation was that Mercanti Jr., dude, just shat the bed like for the umpteenth time, and would again over 25 years. Like, I mean, the guy just absolutely
Your
lost
friend and
control.
mine.
It's, he's saying his stuff like, come on, let's act like men. Let's act like men, gentlemen. Shit like that. Like, what the fuck does that even mean, bro? Just like tell them what you want them to do and what you don't want them to do, and then when they don't do it, like then take a point or whatever. But it was,
He's just an incompetent dude, man. Like he's always been
yeah, dude. I
one of
don't
those
want to just,
referees that he's lived off of his dad's name, and he's gotten big gigs because of that, as we know with other judges, particularly one in Texas. That's kind of had the same deal. And so,
Lawrence Cole. Lawrence Cole. Yeah.
so it happens, but yeah, Mercanti had a bad night. This was one of his worst ones, but
It was an awkward fight. Like I'll give him that, Like it was an awkward fight. I
It
gotta
was
give
an
him that.
awkward fight. It was two
But
styles that didn't really mesh, but it made for like interesting drama. But it was a tough fight to officiate.
I
And
agree, but he
some
did not do it
referees,
well either way.
no, but some referees can handle that. No matter how bad it gets, no matter how rough or whatever it is, they still find a way to be able to hold control and do something,
Yeah, dude. Mills Lane would have pushed someone out of the ring.
Yeah, Mills Lane, how he took care of business.
All right, now listen.
The late Mitch Halpern was another one who was known.
Oh yeah, Mitch was great.
Mitch was great. Richard Steele, whether you like him or not for his stoppages, but he was a guy that could rein things in. Arthur Mercanti Jr. clearly was, but
yeah, it was that was a bad element of this fight for
absolutely. Sure. But it was the fight. I don't want to make it seem like Whitaker was getting outboxed the entire fight. Like he was doing stuff too, like a lot of body work that he's always been notoriously underrated for was definitely work. He was landing body work. He was still landing here, there. Like I said, Hurtado was quicker, but Whitaker was probably more accurate too, because he was Pernell Whitaker. He's a boxing genius. He's still dialing in. He's just struggling and pissed off about it. But as he's going through, when you can tell things take a turn where Whitaker's just like, all right, bullshit's over, is when he gets dropped the second time. Because the first time he laughed, right? When he gets dropped, he kind of giggles it off. The second time when he gets dropped, you hear him go, I haven't watched it in a while, but correct me if I'm wrong. He goes, no, and kind of like slaps himself, right?
He gets up and he's just like, man, or something like that.
He's pissed off. He's actually like annoyed by that. Now he's like, okay, I got to get down to business. Like enough is enough.
Because it was solid. Like the first one was kind of like, shit, I wasn't paying attention. Fuck. All right, you got me. And the second one was like, I was paying attention and you got me. Damn.
And now I'm probably losing this fight. I've been dropped twice and I'm struggling. And now you're making me look bad. And like, I gotta, so.
Well, and stylistically, dude, it was part of the commentating where they were calling it correctly, in my opinion, was that both George and, Merchant were talking about the fact that basically Pernell Whitaker was the type of fighter overall. It wasn't that he was dumb. It wasn't that he was that limited. It was just that he didn't want to lead. Most counterpunchers don't want to lead. They don't want to. Just naturally, they're waiting for their opponent to do something, and then they're going to work off of that. But if they make you follow them, if they make you have to lead, and you're uncomfortable with that, that's tough. And on top of that, that natural southpaw advantage they say southpaw advantage. I think that that's generally true.
It is.
That natural southpaw advantage that Pernell Whitaker would generally enjoy. A guy like Hurtado would have seen countless fucking southpaws in the Cuban amateur system. That would have been nothing to him. Like an amateur, or the southpaw angles would have been like whatever. He didn't give a shit. But making Pernell follow him round after round, and you could see that Pernell didn't want to do that shit, and he wasn't even like cutting the ring off correctly. Like he was like just kind of following him around.
Comfortable with. I mean, Pat, can you actually like recall in other fights where obviously Whitaker has moved forward and we've seen him do things like that, but have you ever seen him like actively have to like chase someone around the ring because Hurtado was making him move?
Nah, it just didn't happen.
It didn't happen.
And when it did happen, it was usually a fight where he could actually have an effect if he landed punches. Exactly. Like it wasn't like he was chasing after him and really nothing happened.
No, but, this was like he had to follow him round after round. And Hurtado was moving a lot. Yeah. And like Whitaker he wasn't a guy that was known for doing that. And at this point in his career, like we said, he was slightly slipped in terms, for a little bit of everything. And he it was just a fight that he was just like, holy shit, like it wasn't easy for him. This was like uncomfortable for him. He was annoyed by having to do all this, and he was working harder than he thought. And like I said, Whitaker was a 10-1 favorite at this fight. Hurtado at that point was proving everybody just like, what the hell? And it was, Whitaker was making it close because, you said, there was point deductions, there was other stuff, and like the constant moving by Hurtado was not winning him any favors either. Whether it was with not Larry Merchant, with Harold Letterman, or I guess with the judges particularly either. But he was still ahead. It was a close fight, but he was still ahead as we got to the late rounds, and that's where things started to unfold.
Even in like, I think it was like the 5th or 6th round or something like that, they said something about the punch stats, and they were like, oh yeah, Whitaker's not doing that great. He threw like 62 shots and landed 20. And I was like, gee, he landed like 30%. That's pretty fucking good. What are you talking about? But that's the whole point, was that he was having to chase him, and the punches weren't really, having the effect. However, finally, Hurtado, from a combination of moving the way he was, from having a high output, and I think probably the body punches, and Pernell was kind of wearing him down a little bit. I mean, it, to a degree anyway. Hurtado started slowing down. He started breathing out of his mouth, and he started getting caught, started kind of getting roughed up a little bit inside where
and I don't know if he had ever, and I'm not sure, and he's never, obviously at that point in his career, never had to fight a fight where he had to keep such a high level concentration, pace, and everything for that amount of time, where anyone would start getting really tired. It was almost like the Meldrick Taylor thing, not so much.
Well, and not on that stage either. Yeah, there's no way.
It's just he started unfolding, started unraveling like a runner that's kind of hits the wall at the end. That's what Hurtado started happening to.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I thought that it looked like to start the 11th round, because like for a few rounds in a row, Whitaker looked like he was finally starting to kind of like gain on him a little bit. Like he wasn't winning, but at least not in my opinion. In Larry Merchant's opinion, Whitaker was winning. But it didn't seem to me like he was winning, but he was finally starting to catch up. It was just like, dude, you got 2 rounds remaining and you're Pernell Whitaker. You don't have a whole lot of power. Fuck you gonna do? And it looked like to begin the 11th round, Hurtado had picked it up and was like, all right, I need to get busy. He started actually snapping his jab out there, was, doing throwing a really nice right hand to the body, right hand to the chest. And then, yeah, dude, out of nowhere, the old, like, I guess, Hurtado wouldn't be considered like a pure puncher by any means, but that old, the puncher issue, dude, that chin.
Yeah.
You got the power, you can't have the chin. Whitaker clips
like
him.
You said, it was a combination of just kind of being exhausted at that point, just keeping that high level pace, and the punishment that he did. Whitaker was very accurate with the shots he was landing, and Hurtado got really fell apart near the end there. But once that last onslaught started, even as a kid, I remember watching that and I was like cringing to myself, turning away, because it was bad. It was bad. And that's where you swing back to Arthur Mercanti, who kind of just sat there with a deer in headlights staring at it, going, while Hurtado took what, 10, 11, 12 unanswered left hands in a row. It was literally just like chopping wood at that point. Just
he wasn't even moving, like changing his angle, technique,
anything.
nothing.
No, he just hit him with the same whap until Hurtado was literally laying unconscious, brutal, eyes rolling around, sprawled out under the ropes. I mean, it's a vicious knockout.
I was saying that I can't remember what month it was, because my memory's not like that, but it was, I'm pretty sure 1990, that Razor Ruddock knocked out Michael Dokes, and he got that free shot right there at the end when Dokes is like suspended against in the
and
ring
then he
post,
hit him with the smash,
and he just fucking with the fucking left hook and kills him. And Mercanti is just like, what's going on in there? Like, and that shit was like, what, 6-7 years earlier than this, man. Like, I just can't believe Hurtado is okay after that and goes to fight on several good fights. I mean, anyway,
so it was a bad knockout. That was a really, really bad one.
You have memories of this yourself, but the only memory I have, because it's not like I wasn't a fan like that to that degree at this point, but I remember seeing that. If it wasn't on Sports Center, it was something similar, because it was like, I remember seeing a replay of it and going like, oh my God. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's pretty shocking stuff. It's the kind of shit where, like, if somebody's not a boxing fan, don't show that to them.
No, no, absolutely not, man. It's like a legal. It's just a bad assault. Like, just not even. It looks like fucking. How would you call it? Like attempted murder almost with like the untrained eye. It was
It's
bad.
bad.
It's really, really bad. But my little experience with that whole show was that like like I was telling you earlier before we recorded. I was like a young fan, but I was still big in, I was still like becoming like a hardcore. I was just watching everything. And we had a black box back then, so I was luckily able to watch whatever I wanted when it came.
Well, hold on. Quickly explain to people who might be slightly too young
Oh
to know what the
yeah,
fuck a
yeah,
black box is.
absolutely. So back in the
Start and
90s,
end the show
and
talk about how old we are.
and I get maybe the 80s too. I don't know when they became a thing, but especially in the early 90s, a black box was the illegal cable box that like you couldn't tell anybody about, or else the rumor was you'd get arrested and everybody would get told for you having it. But it was a box that a little small black box, that's what they call it, that little small cable box, but it had literally every channel that you can imagine, all of them, every single channel, and all the pay-per-views that you wanted for free, they were just like that. All the movies you wanted, Showtime, Cinemax, HBO, even the Playboy and Spice channels, like everything was all out in the open. So like my parents got one when I was a kid. I don't know how they did it, because I don't they got one way before I was even into boxing. Like I was young, they were one of the early ones to get one somehow. And because I remember watching like old WWF pay-per-views with my cousins and shit, like talking like 1989, 1990 type, you know what I mean? So, but yeah, it was the black box. So I was able to watch all those type of shows back then. And I was sworn to secrecy by folks. Don't tell anybody we have the black box. You know, we can get in trouble for that. So that box served us from the late 80s, early 90s, all the way. I think the last pay-per-view my dad watched on it, because I was in college at that point, was Oscar against either Mosley or Oscar against Bernard Hopkins. I think Oscar Hopkins was the last one.
Yeah,
and then
2004
and then it broke, and then it died, and they've been gone ever since. But so that night I was getting ready to watch the fights, and my dad at that point, he worked weekends. He drove limousines, so some weekends he wasn't around. And if that was the case, then I watched the fights by myself. My mom was downstairs. If she was downstairs, she would make sure that she would pull reins that she wouldn't do when my dad was around, which was to make sure I wouldn't yell and scream. She didn't like any of that. So she that night she wasn't feeling good. I remember this, and she laid down. She said, "Don't you make a peep during the entire fight." She was like, "I don't want to hear anything. If I hear you yell, I'm going to send you to bed." That one, okay. So first round, Whitaker gets dropped with the first punch, and I remember she's laying down. I went, yeah, I'm just like, yeah. And I'm looking at her, and I'm going, and then throughout the fight, he gets dropped again. And like doing all that stuff. And finally, and then the last round when he gets knocked out, and I'm like, it took all my energy. I was like turning blue at some points, not to like freak out, because I used to freak out over everything back then, watching the fight over any little thing. So that's why she probably told me to shut up. But yeah, man, it was, regardless, after he finished it, the most relieved person in the entire arena obviously was Oscar De La Hoya, because that fight was still on from there.
Yeah, no, I mean and Pernell salvaged that fight, dude. He salvaged the payday for himself.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he would go on to lose that fight, a fight that many people, and myself included, thought he should have won. But
And you know what, man? For a fight, it was interesting that everybody thought Whitaker, considering how he looked twice against Rivera and then against Hurtado, that a lot of people figured, you know what, Whitaker's washed. Oscar's going to blow him away. Like he's going to be the first one to stop Whitaker. And none of that happened. Whitaker made Oscar look like shit in that fight.
Sure enough, style wise, it was the opposite issue, you know?
Yeah. And maybe, it might have been, I say it like this too. It might have been interesting if Oscar had a different trainer for that fight, now that I look back on it. Because I think he looked the best, in my opinion, when he was trained by, I would say, like Emmanuel Stewart. At least that was my favorite version of him. He came in there just, he had that Kronk kind of like attack first, more everything, right? And he looked really good for the few fights he was with Stewart.
Yeah.
And for the fight with Whitaker, correct me if I'm wrong, he was with the professor Jesus Rivero, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
and
Who
and
is totally like more defense and staying,
he, he tried to he
and
tried to box with him,
yes,
and
and he tried to
instead of
box
coming
Whitaker.
in like with Manny, he was definitely more like offensive with his jab, and like, you know, more
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
which was how Manny wanted his fighters, like using the jab as a weapon, but also as like a good rangefinder and
Mhm,
like for
mhm.
your other shots. And that's kind of how he fought with Manny. But that's the man. I mean, I'm not going to talk badly about Oscar too much because I think that he had a pretty damn good career, but that was kind of one of his Achilles heel type of issues, was that he couldn't stick with trainers, and whenever anything went wrong, he was quick to blame anybody else, like
And the
almost
one
primarily
trainer
the
he
trainer.
always just kind of kept around was probably the worst one.
What's that?
That's in the one trainer he always kept around was probably the worst one in Alcazar. So
Oh yeah, yeah, Roberto Alcazar. Yeah, well,
yeah.
yeah, that's unfortunate, dude. But he had the career he had. He had a pretty good career. And
But I mean, Whitaker also too. To add to really quick, he had the one thing that you know what I mean that like no one thought he was going to have in his career, and that was a last like late round career saving knockout.
yeah,
Like no
one
one
kind
ever
of
thought
last
that would be
hurrah.
Pernell Whitaker ever. Yeah.
Yeah, one kind of like last hurrah, because that wound up being his last
title win.
official win.
Title win. Was it his last official win?
Well, because the Pastrayev, it got
That's
taken
right.
back.
That's right. That did get taken back. Yeah, that was his last official win. Yeah.
Yeah, so unfortunately, and that sucks too, because he would have closed out, well, not totally closed out, but mostly closed out his career, having fought, basically a who's who in the last like 6-7 fights of his career, the welterweight division, dude. Pastrayev was ranked in like the like 8 to 10 or something like that.
And he was scheduled to fight at Corte after that.
So I mean, dude, it was yeah, he would have fought a literal who's who of that welterweight division that we're talking about as a golden era and so scary, as a washed former lightweight who wasn't very big and had no power.
Yeah.
Dude, I mean, that's the greatness of Pernell, man. Rest
I mean, he
in
really did,
peace.
bro. Look at that. Anyone else would have got knocked silly by Trinidad and never would have lasted the distance. Whitaker lasted the distance with a prime Tito with a broken jaw.
With a broken
And
jaw and
broken jaw.
well into a noted, drug issue.
Yeah, yeah. He was going through a lot of issues during that point in his career. And still at certain points, going through all that, there was still hints at flashes of his greatness. I forget which round it was, but there was clearly one he came out there and he had Tito backing up. He's hitting him with jabs, and everyone's just kind of like, "Oh shit," you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
Whitaker could still do it when he had to a little bit. Yeah, beautiful fighter, man. One of my all-time favorites, as I know is one of yours as well.
Just like some of the other guys we mentioned, like Mark Johnson's a really great one, just did not get the acclaim that he should have gotten, despite being an American fighter who had a great amateur career, a really, really, really good pro career. And I mean, just a really undersold and understated, two undersold and understated black fighters, that were from right around that same era. It sucks because you'd like to see them both get more credit. But in this
It's
case, one last hurrah from Pernell, man.
it kind of reminds me of something how these guys don't get appreciated enough, or they do, by the right fans, but like you said, the opportunities, well, the television, all that other stuff. It's something similar to what Teddy Brenner was saying one time about the great light heavyweight Harold Johnson. And Harold Johnson, another great technician back then, great boxer, but a guy that wasn't featured, especially in the golden age of television, as much as a lot of other guys were. And so when someone mentioned that to him, and I don't remember the exact quote, and I kind of wish I did, but like he said something to the effect of like the world can't handle perfection, and Harold Johnson is perfection, or something like that. Or
Well,
yeah,
great light heavyweight
something
champion.
around. It was something around, similar to that. But that's how you kind of
Really,
look at guys like Whitaker, Mark Johnson, others from back then. They were so good and so well that it was just, I don't know,
yeah, underrated light heavyweight champion for sure. That was, and also just a scary looking guy for
dude
sure
was
too.
chiseled from head to toe. Bro. That's.
Yeah, looked like a fucking bodybuilder. But yeah, I think that it's just something where like this is kind of one of those areas where, we'll bring it to a close in a moment, but this is one of those areas where people start talking about hipsters, because it's almost like, you feel as though you have to be above the fray or above like the regular fan or something like that in order to understand the genius of Pernell Whitaker, because you're like, oh, I'm watching this and I understand it, I get it, but he just wasn't appreciated in his time the way he should have
I
been.
can I can be one of those people, bro. When I was a kid, I didn't appreciate Whitaker. I like guys who knock the hell out of each other. You know what I mean? Or like or good boxers who knocked you out, like Terry Norris. I mean, like not good. You know what I mean by that? Like guys who could box but would also try to knock your head off like Norris. That's a better way.
Totally.
So a guy like Whitaker, when I'm a kid, and especially if he's going through a 12-round waltz with someone who can't touch him, I'm kind of like, man, this sucks. As an adult, now that I really realize that no, he wasn't a runner that I used to like think of him as a kid, or no, he didn't do that. Like, no, he's Whitaker was the most complete. Just I love watching him, man. Like watching him is like listening to one of my favorite Blue Note records type thing. Like it's just there's so many layers and so many things you learn and nuances and everything with him. It's beautiful, man. He's art. It's not. It's what Miles Davis described. He was like, when you talk about like beautiful boxers really doing something, that's actual art. That's like the real science to it, man. It ain't just two dudes knocking the shit out of each other. Whitaker made it art.
Well, and I think one of the great things about boxing too is that there's all of it. Like there are brawls and there's crazy ass fights with violence and gore and blood and shit, and there's art. And sometimes like they're the same. Sometimes sometimes the brawls and shit is art, and sometimes the art turns into a brawl, whatever. But it's all together makes boxing.
That's exactly all together makes it the most perfect sport, man, for ghouls like us.
Yeah, for a bunch of fucking nerds like us.
Well, the hop to harp on that really quick, like you just said, sometimes the brawls and everything else. Really briefly mentioned, then I guess it's an easy segue. The other anniversary today was the one of the greatest heavyweight brawls of all time when Foreman Lyle.
Yeah, I was gonna say I was gonna try to find some segue for that, but that's a good segue yourself. Dude, Foreman Lyle obviously is one of those fights where it's an easy fight to introduce like new fans to. It's an easy fight to, it's just you don't have to explain a whole lot. Just throw that shit on and you can see it's two big guys fucking knocking the shit out of each other. And it's great in that regard. And I think another like kind of historical footnote in terms of like the importance of that fight is it's one of the fights that really signals that movement of fights out into Las Vegas and out into the desert as an attraction.
Yeah,
because it was in I believe it was the 50s. I'm pretty sure it was Basilio Robinson, either one or two. I'd have to look, but one of those fights wound up in Vegas, and that was one of the first like Vegas attractions, and it
Robinson,
kind of unfolded
Homer,
from there.
One of the Robinson, I think it was maybe what the third fight, or
yeah, I'd have to look. I don't remember for sure.
Yeah, so absolutely.
And I think that one of the other fights that happened out there was like Gene Fulmer, Don Jordan, I think was another fight that happened out there. But regardless, that was in the 50s, and that was back when it kind of first started. And then it wasn't until a good 15 or so years later with Foreman Lyle that this attraction in Vegas really sparked kind of like, oh shit, we can do this out here. Because remember, right before this era happened was the Caracas Caper. They were doing shit in Kuala Lumpur. They were going all the fuck over for whatever big fights for the site fees, because these far-flung places were willing to just throw money at these fucking promotions.
That's why Ali became the actual world champion, because he was traveling all these different countries.
Yeah, they're willing to throw money at these promotions in order to like get their name out there as like an attraction or a place to go to.
And it was easy for Ali. He had no problem saying, "You want me to go fight in Indonesia against a guy named Rudy Lubbers?" Yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah, for however many million, I'll fly out to some joint and fight some guy. Fine, no problem. I mean, yeah. So, but bringing kind of channeling the fights back to a place like Vegas was big. It was a massive move that still, we still feel that today.
And Caesar's Palace, bro, it's such an iconic venue in general. You know what I mean? Like it really is. It's my all-time favorite venue. But that the pavilion, that like you're alluding to, that was the host. Once that became picked up, that was like the main place. It wasn't MSG. wasn't, other parts of the country. Like Vegas was the main place until
Yeah, you
Donald
brought up
Trump.
Teddy Brenner, but like right around this time was when that transition started really dying out because
Yeah,
Madison Square
yeah.
Garden
In
was
Madison Square
fading
Garden
out.
during the 70s, for instance, I'll give you a perfect example. Like you would just talk about heavyweight boxing. Madison Square Garden in the 70s, they did not, the only times they got a heavyweight title fight, they had Ali Frazier one, and then they had Ernie Shavers. They got Ali Frazier too, but that wasn't a title fight. Then they got Ali, Ernie Shavers. Yankee Stadium got Ali Norton 3. And then in 1979, they got Holmes, Mike Weaver. That was it. Other than that, the only person that was defending the heavyweight championship at Madison Square Garden was either superstar Billy Graham or Howdy Doody Bob Backlund. All right. So,
Yeah.
that wasn't, MSG was basically shut out. Plus, New York was like falling apart at that point. It was not a place you wanted to be around. But the pavilion in Vegas, bro, Caesar's Palace, that was just like that backdrop awning. The whole kind of looked like you were in like a big shed barn type deal. And the fights that took place in there, man, the names Leonard, Duran, Hagler, Hearns, Holmes, Ali, like that was so many iconic fights. And then Foreman and Lyle, well, like you said, it was just like this one where it took place there, and Howard Cosell going horse ringside and everyone losing it. And then you had like this whole like basically a back and forth between fans who thought it was just a stupid slugfest, and they were just like, this is what you call heavyweight boxing, that's the worst thing I've ever seen, if this is the future of heavyweights, we're in trouble. And other people who absolutely loved it and said this was the greatest thing I'd ever seen. Like people thought it was great, but there was other people who thought these were the sloppiest dudes ever. Joe Louis thought, he was like, I've never seen anybody so uncongested and awful like this. Like, it was, but it's interesting now, thinking of now how, almost 50 years later, what is it then, like 45 years or so? How people have like changed it, and from saying it was just like it's become one of the greatest, it's like the catalyst for saying it's like the greatest heavyweight non-title fight in history, probably.
And
It's the gold
easily,
standard. When you mention heavyweight brawls, Foreman Lyle is probably the first one.
exactly. Yeah, you want to talk about like brawls, slugfest, whatever, that's I mean, yeah, clearly it's one of the best heavyweight brawls or whatever and ever. So I mean, you have multiple knockdowns, both guys hurt multiple times, both guys clearly out of energy by the time the fifth round rolls around. Like both guys are like done basically. And I mean, yeah, that's part of what makes it good. But needless to say, that's not what if you're in the corner of either of these guys and looking toward their future, that's not what you want to see. You don't want to see George Foreman totally losing his shit and absolutely fucking baked, by round 5 against Ron Lyle, who was a very hard hitter, but not a super skilled guy, had, a troubled background and pulled himself up. Great story, but not necessarily somebody thought of as like you need to get by Ron Lyle, and you need to get by Ron Lyle easier if you're going to get back to a title shot. And that's kind of, the thought here, the thought process. And so that's
And
not a good look, but
no,
it
no,
was
no.
a great fight.
An amazing fight, and a fight that basically kind of, ruined Ron Lyle. Like Lyle still had success after that. Don't get me wrong. He was still looked upon as a contender until the end of the 70s. But if you look at his record as well, after that, he struggled. You know what I mean? He fought Jimmy Young in a rematch, which Young had his numbers. So I mean, there's no shame in that. Young had a lot of guys' numbers back then. He was awkward as hell. But he also fought dudes like Stan Ward. Stan Ward was a lower level contender from the late 70s and a good fighter, but a guy who just knew, like we mentioned before when we were talking about Bill Sharkey, they had a certain level. You know what I mean? And if you were a top contender like Ron Lyle, you should be able to whip him easy. Lyle struggled hard with Stan Ward. Fought Joe Bugner in a very boring fight that he struggled in too. And soon after that, same thing in a fight with Scott Ledoux. And that's when he was, after that, knocked out by Lynn Ball and subsequently knocked out by Jerry Cooney soon after. And I wonder if Foreman didn't retire soon after the fight with Lyle, do you think he would have had a similar fate too? Because he wasn't looking like $1 million, in those fights afterwards.
Funny footnote, I guess, since I'll, just try to name
Yeah.
drop my book. that's over my shoulder here over the mic. Oscar Bonavena actually mentioned he went out to this fight. He went out to Foreman Lyle and was there ringside, and they asked
Oh,
him.
that's awesome. I didn't even know that.
Yeah, they asked him afterwards. Some reporter asked him afterward because he went to the post-fight press conference and was heckling them, saying they look like amateurs and they looked like shit, which is pretty funny coming from Bonavena, who wasn't the most polished fighter himself. But like, I thought that shit was pretty funny. But nah, dude, it's clear that I think I don't know how much you want to believe George Foreman. A lot of people have kind of said that some of the stuff he says about himself is somewhat contrived. I'm not trying to talk shit. I'm just saying that this is what others have said about him and that he kind of talks himself up and reinvents his own story. But that being said, right around this time, he says that he knew he was in trouble and that his career was kind of sliding downhill and that he was not in any sort of position to, I mean, he did the Foreman Fights 5 shit, which was an absolute, it was an absolute shit fest. And Ali's heckling him the entire time ringside.
That's an incredibly funny video too.
It's
He's
great.
yelling, he's telling all of his opponents, "Lay on the ropes, he'll get tired."
Yeah, dude, it's like awful. It's like it's like watching pro wrestling. It's kind of that atmosphere
Absolutely.
because it's like it's everything seems like informal. He's like laying around, he's like going draping over the ropes. Ali's talking shit to him the entire time. He's fucking fighting from ringside and shit like that. But then I think the point is that like even Foreman seemed to know at that point, like he was, his career seemed to be dwindling. I don't know whether or not he really thought he can get it back, but dude, yeah, it was going downhill, and he seemed like he knew it.
I mean, if he had got by the Jimmy Young fight, because Jimmy Young even said that Foreman touched him a couple more times in a round that he was out in, that would have been kaput for him. Well, that was in 77. I mean, to think if he could have got an Ali rematch at that point, it's not out of the realm to say that he could have beat Ali in a rematch if he had like paced himself better and maybe just won a decision, because Ali was at that point where it could have happened, right?
Totally.
But,
Yeah.
After that, then Larry Holmes was coming on the scene, and I think, in my opinion, 1978 Holmes, 79 Holmes definitely would have beat Foreman.
Well, yeah, and at that point, Foreman would have they would have crossed. It would have been too much.
Yeah.
Like after that, Holmes would have gotten a little bit too good or a little bit too cognizant, and Foreman would have been too slow.
Exactly.
It just wouldn't have made sense. So might have been a small window where Foreman could have captured something in the late 70s, but that would have been it, dude.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so it probably worked out best for Foreman to retire the way he did, and then came back and had that improbable comeback and everything. But yeah, for Lyle, it definitely that fight, it would have taken anything out of anybody, man. It was such a brutal, vicious fight, and to get the head, even though you had success against George Foreman, more success than basically anyone else ever aside from Muhammad Ali in terms of actually hurting that beast. It still took the remaining juice out of him too. That was bad, bro. Like that's the one that's held to every standard. The first time he mentioned Ron Lyle, oh man, the George Foreman fight, and no one's ever gonna forget that. That shit is just crazy. So yeah, it was worth the it had to be mentioned. But we've also been like talking a ton about heavyweights and those particular eras lately too. So
yeah. So yeah, it was nice to get a good break with the welterweights. Absolutely. For sure.
Cool.
Well, dude, I appreciate you taking a little trip back in history with me to do a little.
Oh, this was a blast, man. I had so much fun talking about this. In my childhood, man. Anytime I could talk about my childhood, sure. I can reminisce about shit like that. I'm going to be hyped about. Because what do we say? We're old as dirt now.
Yeah, man. We're getting there, man. We're getting there. No, dude, I appreciate it. It was a good time, and I appreciate everybody who listens in or watches, whatever the case may be. If you did watch on YouTube, for instance, I would appreciate it if you go ahead and like the video, and also if you subscribe to the channel. It's very helpful. But if you listen, whatever podcast app you listen in, subscribe there as well. Give us a rating. Also helpful. Aris, if you're gonna find this fine gentleman here, for instance, on Twitter, find him at Punch Zone Aris on Twitter. Find me, Patrick Connor, at Patrick M. Connor, but we're also on Facebook, Instagram, those nice things if you want to try to find us there. And yeah, man, that's about it, Aris. We'll talk soon, bro.
Have a good one, everyone.
Take it easy, everybody.